Welcome to this explainer. Now, if you've ever seen Spike Lee's absolutely iconic movie about Malcolm X, you've probably heard of the Nation of Islam, or the NOI. But how much do you actually know about its roots? Well, let's dive right into it. Today we're unpacking the incredibly complex and really fascinating history of this Afro-American religious movement. We're going to stick strictly to the historical data and source materials to figure out exactly how a movement with such unique and often highly controversial beliefs became an absolute massive force in 20th century American history. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at their origins during the Depression. Then, Elijah Muhammad's rise to power, followed by the era of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. After that, we'll break down their unique theology, and finally look at the schism, evolution, and legacy of the movement.
All right, Section 1, Origins in the Depression.
Right off the bat, we need to make a really clear distinction. While the Nation of Islam positions itself as a Muslim movement, our sources show that back in its early days, it was entirely distinct from Orthodox Islam. Founded in the 1930s, its original doctrines were intensely focused on race, specifically advocating for black supremacy and a complete separation from white society.
To really understand why this ideology caught on, we have to rewind to the 1930s. During the Great Migration, thousands of Afro-Americans were fleeing the horrific racism of the Jim Crow South, right? They were heading up to northern industrial cities like Detroit, looking for a better life. But instead of a promised land, they walked right into the Great Depression, meaning crushing poverty and, unfortunately, continued discrimination. It was in this really desperate environment that radical solutions started sounding incredibly appealing. Enter a highly enigmatic guy named Wallace Fard in 1930. Some thought he was of Middle Eastern descent, but nobody really knew for sure. He started the movement, gained traction, and then just vanished without a trace in 1934.
Moving on to Section 2, Elijah Muhammad's Rise.
So, Fard's sudden disappearance left this massive void. And stepping right into that void was his successor, a man born Elijah Poole, who soon became known as Elijah Muhammad. He basically took Fard's teachings and kicked them into overdrive. He taught that the original humans were black, and explicitly labeled white people as devils. He fiercely argued that black Americans needed to pack up and live in their own entirely independent state. But here's the thing, he didn't just talk about it, he actually built it. Throughout the 30s and 40s, he created this incredibly self-sustaining community infrastructure. We're talking private schools, independent businesses, new places of worship, and even their own paramilitary unit called the Fruit of Islam. He was quite literally building a nation within a nation.
Section 3, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali.
This brings us to what a lot of historians consider the golden age of the movement, and it was entirely fueled by pure charisma. The NOI was growing, sure, but it absolutely exploded when a man named Malcolm Little discovered it while serving time in prison. Upon his release in 1952, he joined up and famously changed his last name to X, representing the African ancestral name that had been stolen from his family. Malcolm X quickly became the group's most vital, electric spokesperson. He launched their official newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, and his magnetic speeches brought in massive waves of followers. And that included a young, ridiculously talented boxer named Cassius Clay, who you probably know better as Muhammad Ali.
But as you might guess, this powerful partnership was not built to last. Things started unraveling incredibly fast around 1963 when a deep ideological and personal dispute blew up between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. By 1964, Malcolm was officially out. He traveled to Mecca for the Hajj, and that experience profoundly shifted his entire worldview, leading him to fully embrace traditional Orthodox Islam. Tragically, the fallout with the NOI was incredibly bitter. In 1965, right in the middle of giving a speech, Malcolm X was assassinated by radical members of the Nation of Islam.
Let's look at Section 4, Unique Theology and Beliefs.
It is so fascinating to compare the early NOI directly with Orthodox Islam. Now, they definitely shared some common ground, things like daily prayers, completely avoiding pork, and strictly banning alcohol and drugs. But when you look at the core theology, it's like night and day. For example, Orthodox Islam fasts during the lunar month of Ramadan, right? The early NOI chose to fast in December. More importantly, mainstream Islam strictly teaches that God is one and unseen. The early Nation of Islam taught that their mysterious founder, W. Fard, was actually the awaited Messiah, the Mahdi, and the literal physical incarnation of God on earth.
And the source material highlights another incredibly specific detail about their theology. The early NOI taught that all races originally descended from the black race. but they specifically believed that the white race was artificially created in a laboratory exactly 6,000 years ago by a black scientist named Yusuf. It's a wildly unique theological narrative that you really only find within this specific movement.
Finally, Section 5, Schism, Evolution, and Legacy.
Before we talk about where they are today, we really need to pause and ask a fundamental question. Why did a movement with such radical views succeed in the first place? To get it, we have to put ourselves in the historical context of the time. Think about the centuries of deep trauma from slavery, followed by the relentless, institutionalized racism of the early 20th century. For so many Afro-Americans facing that daily systemic oppression, a message that fiercely championed black supremacy, total self-reliance, and unshakable community solidarity, it wasn't just appealing, it was a lifeline.
You know, despite its aggressive and racially exclusionary doctrines, we can't ignore the undeniable positive impacts the NOI had on its community. Operating right alongside Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights era, the Nation of Islam successfully restored its sense of self-esteem for its members. They actively kept at-risk youth off the streets and away from drugs, highly promoted education, and built internal networks to actually get people jobs. They created a powerful, protective shield around the community when nobody else would.
So what happened next? Well, when Elijah Muhammad passed away in 1975, he had around 250,000 followers. But without him at the helm, the movement completely fractured. His son, Warithdin Muhammad, took charge and actually started steering this massive organization away from its radical roots, bringing it into mainstream Orthodox Islam and eventually renaming it the American Society of Muslims. But as you can imagine, not everyone was on board with that. A very prominent spokesperson named Louis Farrakhan splintered off. In 1981, he officially restarted the Nation of Islam, explicitly returning to Elijah Muhammad's original, highly controversial teachings.
You might actually be surprised to hear that the NOI spawned a few other distinct offshoots that are still around today. One of the most famous is the Five Percenters. They might be smaller in terms of strict religious following, but their cultural impact? Absolutely massive. They heavily influenced the slang, the style, and the core themes of modern hip-hop and rap music.
Which brings us to one profound final thought. How does a movement with such extreme views become an absolutely undeniable part of the struggle for Afro-American identity? Well, the history of the Nation of Islam is a testament to how complicated history actually is. It shows us how deep pain and marginalization can birth really radical theologies that end up fostering both profound controversy and an incredible, undeniable community resilience. I hope this explainer gave you a much clearer picture of this fascinating movement. Keep exploring, and thanks for joining me.